This is the Timney Alpha Glock trigger. It's made for Gen 3 and Gen 4 Glocks. And this trigger takes a different approach than any other Glock trigger. And one thing that I've always stated, whenever I'm talking about different types of guns and stuff, is the M&P has one of the worst triggers from the factory. But when you upgrade it with an Apex, it becomes one of the best striker fire triggers you've ever tried in your life. Whereas I always felt like Glock came with a slightly better trigger than the stock M&P, but when you upgraded it, it made the trigger better, but it didn't make it nowhere near as nice as the M&P. Well, this one, I think, probably changed the game. Just to show you a couple of things before we, take it apart and I show you what it's all about. For example, with a standard Glock trigger, right? You have your trigger in the reset position. When you pull the trigger shoe stays back. Most other guns don't do that. And like, for example, with this M&P here, trigger's forward in the reset position, but when you let go, a spring kicks it forwards. This Glock is a lot like the M&P trigger. You pull this trigger and the trigger shoe comes back anyway. And I thought that was very strange. But the best part about this trigger is it doesn't cost much more than an Agency Arms trigger, about $150, and that includes the entire kit. However, this thing is far more advanced than any Agency Arms trigger or any other trigger that I've ever tried in my life, yet it still comes in at about $150. It's about $30 more than the Apex kit that comes with the connectors and rounded plungers and all that stuff. And this thing doesn't come with any of that. It comes with stuff that's totally different, and they've actually changed the way that this trigger actually functions in the gun, which I thought was pretty crazy. A couple of things that I do want to answer in this video is, number one, does it work the way that they say it will work? Does it have any flaws in regards to defeating the safeties? I want to go over that. The other thing I want to talk about is, would I buy it knowing what I know now? And then the last thing I want to talk about, aside from the range footage, is this something that I would carry? Or is this something that I would reserve for competition use? This is my Gen 3 Glock 19 that I had customized way back in, I think 2017 it was. I know a lot of people are gonna ask about this slide. The slide was made by a company called Loki Tactical, and unfortunately they don't do slides anymore, but I really love this slide. This barrel here is from a company called Mayhem Syndicate. It has a proprietary barrel with a shortened compensator, and the compensator works very well. This was a prototype. They actually prototyped it with an S3F Solutions barrel, but they no longer use those. And also this little tip here is actually different now. Mine has a roll pin, but now they have them where they have a detent. I'll have a full list, guys, so the first link in the video description, and that will take you to a separate page. You'll find a complete list. I got the Holosun 507C X2 on here. I'm currently testing this to see how I like it versus the standard 507C. Love this build to death. Had it custom stippled, got a Blacklist Industries magwell on it, Enforce APLC light. I got XS big dot suppressor height sights. And then I have my ETS mag. So before we go over, the ins and outs of this guy, I wanted to just do a brief overview of how the standard Glock triggers work, just in case you forgot, or maybe you're new and you don't understand. So with a standard Glock trigger, they are the most basic trigger system ever. You have this little spring here, and this spring helps your reset and all that cool stuff. This little guy is your trigger bar, and it goes against this thing here, which is called your connector. And your connector is what gives you your reset snap. So when you reset, it does this, like that. And then on this side here, you can see this ledge. So when this gun is in the reset position, you can see this cruciform of this trigger bar. It won't go down. That's one of your drop safeties. So then as you pull the trigger back, it's allowed to come down, and that's what makes the trigger go boom. The only way to really lighten these triggers is a lot of people have polished them. That's one way to really smooth them out. It can reduce the weight a little bit. Another way to reduce the weight is to change out this connector that has a different angle on it. And I believe the more shallow the angle, the lighter the trigger. Another thing that people like to do, like with this one, this is an aftermarket trigger, but it has a little screw here so you can adjust what they call the take-up. And basically what the take-up is when you adjust that screw, it adjusts the angle of the trigger shoe in relation to the bar. Basically what it's doing when you're taking out pre-travel is you're actually pre-pulling the trigger. So sometimes if you take out too much pre-travel, it will scoot this bar back where it's no longer on the shelf and it's no longer drop safe. The other way that you reduce the weight of a trigger, you change out the spring on the firing pin or you change out the spring right here on your safety plunger. The reason that is when you pull this trigger, this head here depresses this plunger here. So it kind of skates across right there. So if that's easier to push up, it makes the trigger lighter. The other way is if you make this spring lighter, the way this works is this fella here. So usually this little edge here rests against the back of the trigger bar, which is called the cruciform. And there's an engagement there. And then there's a lot of pressure put on this by the slide. And then when you pull this trigger, this piece falls, releasing this and letting the firing pin go. And then that's how the gun goes bang. The downside to changing springs, number one with this, if you change this spring out, you will probably get some light primer strikes. The downside to changing out this spring here, your safety plunger spring, is if you go too light. So for example, if this isn't pushed up, your firing pin can't come through the breech face and it can't puncture the primer on the casing. So if this is too light, that could probably, go up and down by shaking it, depending on how light the spring is. It can be kind of complicated and sometimes kind of dangerous to make your Glock trigger too light. And so this is where this guy here comes in. So to really appreciate this trigger, we're gonna take it apart. So the first thing you should notice, I'm gonna wipe this down, is I do have a polished firing pin and I do have a polished safety plunger in here, but all the springs are OEM. So I just polished them up. It makes them run a little smoother, but I polished them with a Dremel and some polishing compound. But none of that's changed. Everything that's changed is in here. The first thing you should notice, there's a spring here, this guy's touching, and that spring is for this piece right here. Now, you'll also notice, and if you can see it, there's another spring right beside it. And that's the spring we install that makes the trigger automatically reset. But that's not where the magic is. So I took everything off, but you can see this spring, it's right there, and it rides like that on your trigger. But you can see as there's pressure pushed right here, it makes it come right back. So that's one of the cool features. But this is where the magic is. I'm just gonna take it out real quick. You can see down in there this red thing. This is what makes the trigger incredibly different. On the right side here, I have the standard Glock trigger. And you can see back here, this entire cruciform piece has been redesigned. And that's because this piece right here that moves lengthwise is actually moved to this piece right here. So when you put this down like this, they almost look very similar. So earlier I was showing you on a standard Glock trigger, these two pieces meet. When you pull the trigger, this comes down and that goes forwards. There's limited ways that you can actually lighten it. Well, with this one, this has a spring that kicks up and down. And this piece, as you pull the trigger, glides across this, just like that. I hope you guys can see that. It just glides across, and this is the piece that actually sits on the firing pin. Really interesting. I thought that was really cool. This piece here on the front, you also have an adjustable trigger shoe so you can take out some of the take up. Factory setting out of the box has the most take up that you can get on it. So it's set in the safest position because, as I mentioned, as you remove take up, you're essentially pulling the trigger and it can fall off that safety shelf. So how does this pig install? Well, in the box, they also include some tools here for you. So it's like this multi-tool and it comes with like these 3 different heads here. One of the reasons I'm gonna do this all over again is there is a piece that you need to put some blue Loctite on. I like this stuff, it's like a glue stick for Loctite. But let me show you real fast. So this piece here, when you take it out of the box, it's gonna have this tiny little screw already threaded in. And that's the screw you need to Loctite. And I'll show you exactly why. So you just find the appropriate little head here. My first couple of range trips, I didn't have this piece Loctited in and it came out. Now, fortunately for me, because I have a magwell here that seals off the back strap, I didn't lose it. But if I didn't have a magwell on it, the back straps here are typically open. So if that would have fell out without a magwell, I would have lost this tiny little screw. So that's the one you want to Loctite. I wouldn't use red, I would just use some blue Loctite. Let's talk about the trigger pull. There's the take up. I didn't remove a lot of take up at all from this. Here's the break. Here's the reset. Reset's a little bit slow. It's a little bit weak. We're gonna cover that more here in a minute. Take up, break, reset. Compare that to my M&P 2.0. Take up, break, reset. It is very close to the M&P, and I've never seen a Glock trigger get that close to the M&P Apex trigger ever. So that's a good thing. Let's go over to trigger weight. With this trigger, there's not really a way to adjust the weight of it. I guess if you wanted to make it lighter, you could use lighter springs if you so chose. I haven't tried it that way. The other thing is your connector. So right now I'm using a minus connector. Minus connectors usually lower your trigger pull weight by about a half a pound or so. Let's see what this runs at. So I got about 2.5 pounds. That one pulled 2.3 pounds. With a stock connector, it should pull around 3 pounds. I tested it a few times earlier, and it pulled at a consistent 3 pounds if you're gonna use like an OEM connector. So all that's cool, but how does it translate to the real world? What are the pros and cons of this? Does it malfunction? Does it defeat drop safeties? Back up top. So it's pretty crazy, right? When you start looking at the intricacies of the way this trigger works, like I was showing you up close, it's pretty insane how they really thought outside the box. And you know, and lately in the past few videos, I've been trying to test products that are outside the box. Kind of like my last video that I did on red dots from Grace Optics. I love the fact that they were trying something different, but the problem with the Grace Optics that I had was that it solved one problem and then created another problem. And that makes me wonder, is that gonna happen with this one? And so going to the range, this is what it was like to shoot it. It's running just as well on round number 1 as it did on like round number 400. It's very consistent and it shoots very nicely. I put a few hundred rounds through it over the course of about 3 different weekends. I really wanted to put it through its paces because I wanted to make sure that it was gonna work. One of the downsides to a lot of Glock triggers, especially when you start lightening them up to like 2.5 pounds, 3 pounds, is they become very unsafe because you're changing out some of the springs, you're making the springs lighter, or you're taking the take up out so far that it's no longer on the drop safety of the trigger housing shelf. I wanted to make sure that that wasn't gonna happen with this one. And I have beat the crap out of this on the floor. I test all of my guns the same way in regards to drop safe. The one way that I've always been able to get a gun to fail, if it's going to fail, is to smash it on a hard carpeted floor right here. And I have not been able to get this trigger to fail whatsoever. And I think a lot of that has to do with, you know, not only having the trigger safety here, but also having a spring that keeps this trigger forwards, also prevents it. I also tried hitting it like this, trying to make the trigger bar fall off of the ledge. I took out a lot of the take up to see if that would happen. And that didn't happen. Now, as I was shooting this at the range, there was only like one little thing that I ran into, and it wasn't really a problem. It was just more of I have a really light trigger. Oh crap, I didn't mean to pull it. So typically whenever I am at the range and I go to take my first shot, right? I will take my gun out and I will put my finger and I will get the trigger set at the wall by the time I'm here. And then I will pop off the shot. With this one, however, the wall is there, but because the wall is so easy to break through, there's a couple times where I went to press out and just have the trigger preset and I accidentally popped a shot off. And that wasn't a problem with the gun, that was just me learning how to operate with a lighter trigger. So let's talk about the pros and the cons. The pros are, number 1, it is a very advanced trigger and it is very affordable for what you get. Buying just an Agency Arms trigger with trigger bar was around $150. This one comes with an adjustable trigger, meaning you can adjust the take up. It comes with the trigger bar that's redesigned for this system. It comes with the system that sits down into the trigger housing. It comes with that additional spring that you add, and it comes with all these little tools also that you use in order to get this gun, installed correctly and running properly. And so for $150, I feel like this is the most trigger you get for the money in regards to aftermarket Glock triggers. So that's a good thing. The second pro is you're able to lighten the trigger now to competition levels without compromising the drop safety. I have beat the crap out of this gun and I can't get the drop safety to be defeated. The next pro to this is it's almost a idiot-proof way to lighten your trigger, because when you start messing with Glock triggers, you start messing with the tolerances, you start messing with the engagement of the cruciform on the striker. If you don't really know what you're doing, you can really make your gun unsafe. It's absolutely possible. But this makes it kind of idiot-proof, so to speak, where you just install it and it lightens your trigger to 2.5 to 3 pounds, depending on what connector you use. With the stock connector, I get 3 pounds. With a minus connector, I get 2.5 pounds. And it was super simple as long as you can install it. And if you don't know how to install it, every Glock trigger known to man says to have a licensed gunsmith install it for you. And that's just for insurance purposes. And so those are some great pros, but let's talk about the cons. I had to really search high and low to find some cons about this, but here's what I came up with. Number one, it's not the easiest trigger to install. The hardest part of installing this trigger is getting that front trigger spring that actually resets the trigger into place without it flying everywhere. It kind of reminds me of doing an M&P trigger. You have to get that, it has that same kind of spring in it. And if you don't get that spring in there just right, it'll bind up and sometimes won't work correctly. The next con about this is you can't really increase the trigger pull above 3 pounds. With a factory connector, you get 3 pounds. If you go minus connectors and stuff like that, you're gonna get less than 3 pounds. So if you're not comfortable with a 3-pound trigger, you might not wanna carry with it until you've got a ton of rounds through it. Third con that I could find about this is the reset on this trigger kind of leaves a little bit to be desired. And what I mean by that, so if you look at this is my Apex trigger. I have the trigger completely pulled back. And when I go to reset it, I can feel the trigger pushing my finger forwards. With this one, on the other hand, when I'm gonna ride this reset out, it's like my finger has to move before I can feel the trigger starting to come forward. I don't feel it pushing my finger home, which can be kind of disorienting if you're used to trigger resets pushing your finger out. So it has a little bit of a weak reset. And I kind of started looking at the way that this thing works. There would really only be one way to really increase it, and that would be to change out that front spring. Now, the downside to changing out that front spring is if you put a stronger spring in it, it would also make the trigger heavier. So maybe in the future, they could come out with additional springs you could buy that would not only increase the force of the reset, but also increase the trigger pull weight. So what are my thoughts on this in regards to concealed carry or self-defense? So I'm not a stranger to carrying a 3-pound trigger. This M&P, I carried this thing for a year, I think in 2017 or 2018. I'm trying to remember which year, but I carried this thing almost every day for a year. And this one has the Apex trigger. And with the Apex trigger for the M&Ps, you get all these different springs and stuff. And it tells you, use these springs for a duty style pull and use these springs for the competition style pull. And I put the competition style pull. This trigger pulls at 3 pounds. However, the difference between this trigger and this trigger is even with the competition springs, when I get to here, that wall is pretty firm. I can preset this trigger, no problem, and not accidentally pull through it. Whereas with this one, it took a little bit of practice to get used to. So I have carried with the 3-pound trigger and I'm not afraid of it. And what I mean by afraid of it is the one thing you don't want to have happen in a self-defense scenario is, let's just say you did have to draw your gun. You don't want to present your gun and accidentally shoot somebody that you weren't intending to shoot. And this trigger kind of gives me that kind of vibe. Like, I feel like if I carried with this trigger and I pressed out and I was nervous and scared, I might accidentally pull through that trigger and shoot before I'm ready to shoot. And or maybe I didn't have the target completely identified, and then you could shoot someone that you didn't want to shoot at all. So that's the only thing that kind of bothers me about it. Now, that's just my finger, you know what I mean? After shooting it for about 400 rounds, I did realize that I got a lot better at presetting that trigger without pulling through. The downside is I wasn't training as if I was being attacked by someone. So if there's really a threat coming at me, I don't know how my finger would react. So the only way to really train around it, I would say, is if you press out and don't preset the trigger, and then when you're ready to shoot, you come down and pull the trigger. Depending on the way you train and the way that you present your gun and stuff like that, that's all gonna be a personal decision. I think if you have really good trigger discipline, you'll be okay. However, with the caveat of it could be a slippery slope of accidentally pulling the trigger when you're not really trying to, you're just trying to preset it. Otherwise, I think this is a phenomenal trigger. I would 100% buy it again, knowing what I know now. And number two, I think it's just, I'm gonna keep it in this gun. I don't really carry this gun anymore. I've been carrying more basic guns just in case I have to use them. And then if I use them, they get confiscated. I'd rather have, something that's a little bit more affordable. And the reason I wanted to retire this gun from carry is Low-Key Tactical no longer makes these slides, and I really like this slide, and I'd hate for it to get taken. But ultimately, it comes down to this, guys. What are your thoughts on the Timney Alpha trigger? I'd love to hear what your thoughts are. Again, like I mentioned earlier, follow the first link in the description if you want to pick one of these triggers up. Sometimes they're sold out, sometimes they're on pre-order, but usually there's a way to say, email me when they're in stock and you can pick them up. I really feel like this is the most advanced and probably one of the best Glock triggers that I've tried to date. But it doesn't matter what I think. Let me know your thoughts. But until next time, guys, I love you. You guys stay sexy.